We've heard a lot on the campaign trail. After Monday, you're right, the real business of governing, of making tough decisions is there. And I think people like the incoming Secretary of Defense will realize very well that his job is going to be massively easier in keeping American troops safe and in protecting American interests around the world if he's got 31 allies in NATO than if he doesn't have those allies and the United States is totally alone.
Today and tomorrow, the Allied Chiefs of Defence will meet with the NATO Secretary General, and this is taking place as we speak. What do we know so far about what's expected to be discussed and what's already been said?
Well, I think there are a number of issues, as you could imagine, on an agenda for a two-day meeting. I think most urgently, there's something called Baltic Sentry. What is Baltic Sentry? Well, yesterday, a number of heads of state, including the NATO Secretary General, met in Helsinki to look at this sort of urgent issue of what to do about the sabotage of pipelines and telecommunications cables in the Baltic Sea. There have been a number of incidents lately of suspicious Russian vessels, Chinese vessels, sabotaging these cables and pipelines, causing electricity outages, economic loss. And so one of the big issues now for NATO is what can it do to sort of better monitor commercial shipping in the Baltic Sea to prevent these incidents, deter these incidents, and particularly monitor more the so-called Russian shadow fleet of oil tankers that are not only being used to export Russian oil, but also can be involved in these sort of sabotage activities. So this means clearly finding ships, finding drones, maritime patrol aircraft, coastal vessels, and really bringing this under a NATO headquarters because you remember piracy in the Gulf of Aden a few years ago. This is the kind of effort that you may have to keep up for a while. So generating the ships, the aircraft, the forces, who does what, that's, I think, going to be the number one topic. The second topic, very briefly, is that, of course, NATO is now in a very tense situation with Russia. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And NATO has these plans to make sure that it can, if necessary, quickly reinforce Central and Eastern Europe to defend allies. Brigades have to move, tanks have to move, aircraft have to move. So they'll be looking at just how ready NATO is if it has to fight tomorrow. I think the third issue will be assistance to Ukraine, unsurprisingly. Last week, there was a meeting of NATO defense ministers at Ramstein in Germany, plus a number of other countries, looking at what they can do to make sure that the weapons continue to flow to Ukraine, to keep Ukraine in the fight, to keep the Ukrainian electricity grid running with better air defense. And so the chiefs of defense, I think, will be looking at, okay, how quickly can we get those systems to Ukraine? How quickly can we train Ukrainian forces? What more can we do? And NATO has recently taken over this role, just very recently, with a special headquarters in Wiesbaden in Germany. And so I think the chiefs of defense will be saying, well, is it up and running? Is it functioning smoothly? Is it making a difference in terms of better coordination and getting the weapons transferred to Ukraine more quickly? So I think those are going to be the three key items.
And in his opening remarks, the NATO Secretary General, he said that it's a time to shift to a wartime mindset. And he stressed this increase in defense spending. And earlier this week, we had the President-elect Donald Trump. He wanted to see NATO allies spending around 5% of their GDP on defense spending, especially with Trump coming into office on Monday. How do we see NATO allies responding to this? We've had mixed reviews so far about increasing their defense spending, but what do you think on that?
Well, I think many of them, even those who spend a lot of money on defense, will probably think that the Trump goal of 5%, if that really is the goal, because of course Trump isn't yet president, so none of what he says, if you like, is official US policy yet, at least not until Monday. So I think many of them will think, well, 5%, no, we're probably not going to get there because it would bankrupt our economies. In the case of Germany, they would have to find an extra 200 billion euros. Very difficult, particularly with the German economy now in recession 2 years in a row. And even America itself spends 3.4%. So they're not at 5% either. So I think most of the people in NATO will see this as a kind of Trump starting point. He likes to sort of set the bar high for his initial negotiating position. But I think many of them will realize that when Trump comes to Europe for the NATO summit in The Hague in June, he's going to expect at least more than 2%, which is the current NATO target, even if 9 allies currently aren't at 2%. So I think that this is the beginning of a bit of a negotiation as to where we're going to come out. And I think most allies will probably think that between 2% and 5%, they're going to come out by June at around 3%, 3.5%. But again, this is going to be difficult because it's all very well to set these targets, but it's another thing to find the resources to really meet them. As I mentioned, there's only recently, in the last year or so, have the bulk of allies actually got up to the 2% mark.
And the Secretary General, he did suggest that there could be joint buying of weapons, equipment, and innovation, which could, in general, reduce the amount of funding that's required per NATO ally on their defense spending. What do you make of that?
Well, absolutely, because it's one thing to have a lot of money, but as you know, you can waste a lot of money very easily. And defense is an area where you can really waste money quickly if you don't have cooperation. For example, in Europe, we still have 16 different types of shipyards, 5 different types of fighter aircraft. It's estimated by the European Parliament that the EU member states of NATO waste about 100 billion euros a year in duplication of programs, different countries, different tanks and all of that. So there's no doubt about it. If you can have more standardization around one dominant system, one aircraft, one tank, one shipyard, one type of frigate, you're going to save a lot of money. So the taxpayers, I think, will not accept to spend a lot of extra money on defense if they don't see evidence that that money is being spent more wisely. So that's one part of the challenge. But the second part of the challenge is that it's no good also having a lot of extra money for defense if you don't have the defense industry production lines, which have the tools, the materials, the chemicals, the metallurgy, to be able to translate that money into weapons. You can't fight with dollar bills. You can only fight with shells and tanks. And we know that NATO has had problems in the past getting defense industry to adequately stockpile its systems. There's been this difficult debate that, if I give a Patriot air defense system to Ukraine, I'm leaving myself vulnerable, and so should I do it? Robbing Peter to pay Paul. So I think the other side of all of this is not just reduce duplication, but is to get defense industry to really open up the production lines so that you can efficiently translate this money quickly into the kind of stockpiles we need. If defense industry takes 20 years to produce new systems, and NATO generals are warning about the prospect of a war with Russia, hypothetically in 2 or 3 years, you can see the kind of bind that NATO is going to be in.
And surely manpower plays into that as well. I mean, last month it was revealed that 1/5 of the UK armed forces, they're not fit to fight, according to the MOD. How significant a part do you think that plays into this as well?
Well, it's the same of all NATO armies. For example, Portugal a few years ago, although it was a few years ago, was spending the bulk of its military salaries on pensions for its colonial army from Africa from the 1960s and 70s. So clearly there is a need to change what NATO calls the tooth to tail ratio. In other words, in any defense budget, that part which is actually fighting troops in the front line and equipping them and training them, and that part which is people sitting behind desks. Of course, you need people sitting behind desks, but dealing with procurement and logistics and administration and all of those kind of things. And that's been a problem, I think, for all of NATO armies in the past. In other words, you have a large army, but how much of that army is deployable within a couple of days, has the equipment, the training necessary to go into the front line immediately. And so that, yes, is going to be, I think, a considerable challenge for everybody. But at the same time, it's also a challenge for countries like the UK, because on the one hand, you have to raise the size of the army, which is the smallest that it's been, 70,000 since the Napoleonic Wars. But on the other hand, there's a need to replace a lot of equipment, as we know as well. And so balancing what you spend on manpower or women power and what you spend on equipment, getting that into the right kind of order, not easy. And that's why people like the NATO Secretary General believe that if that issue is going to be fixed, 3% or 4% of GDP on defense is going to be the baseline. You're not really going to be able to do both of those, manpower and equipment, with just a 2%. So yes, difficult choices ahead for governments, particularly when they look at things like education and social spending and other priorities as well, and making the case with voters that defence has to have a higher priority in the pecking order, where it's been coming down that pecking order since the end of the Cold War. Not an easy political job either.
And as I mentioned before, we've got Trump's inauguration on Monday. Yesterday, we saw questioning of Trump's nomination for Defense Secretary. We didn't have too much on what he might do in terms of Russia and Ukraine. It was very vague about that. But in his book, he did write that NATO is a relic, at best a distraction. It should be scrapped and remade. What sort of picture does that paint for the US's relationship with NATO moving forward from Monday?
Well, it's easier to sell books, quite frankly, or newspaper articles that if you write NATO is a relic and should be replaced, you're going to get more attention that way than if you write that NATO is a perfectly good organization. People say a lot of things when they're out of office, or they're in new media jobs, of course, as this gentleman was beforehand with Fox News. Once they're in office, they tend to see things very differently. I mean, let me just give you an example: Ukraine, where we heard on the campaign trail, not just from Trump, but from Trump supporters, that he would solve the issue before he got to the Oval Office, or he would solve it in 24 hours. Now, even before the inauguration, they're all saying, no, of course, we didn't really mean that. We recognize it can't even be done in 100 days. It's going to take several months. It's going to be difficult. Trump even said publicly that it was going to be more difficult to get peace in Ukraine than peace in the Middle East. So you see already the dawn of realism, aspiration hitting reality, if you like. And I think you're going to see more of this. And a lot of the criticism was basically to simply, give NATO a bit of a shake-up. To spend more money on defense. And I remember from being in previous meetings with Trump when I was a NATO official that he claimed credit for saving NATO, not for getting rid of it, by saying that his shock therapy was what was required to get the Europeans to spend more money on defense. And ultimately, he should be given the credit for making NATO stronger, not NATO weaker. So, we've heard a lot on the campaign trail. After Monday, you're right, the real business of governing, of making tough decisions is there. And I think people like the incoming Secretary of Defense will realize very well that his job is going to be massively easier in keeping American troops safe and in protecting American interests around the world if he's got 31 allies in NATO than if he doesn't have those allies and the United States is totally alone.